Hi, I'm Tom Luna. I'm a former school board member. I was privileged to serve as senior advisor to U.S. Secretary of Education Rod Page. I also had the honor of serving for 8 years as Idaho State Superintendent of Public Instruction. During that time, I also served as president of the Council of Chief State School Officers. One thing I have learned in all these experiences is that educating children is not rocket science, it's more complicated. On my podcast, Swimming Upstream, we will visit with courageous leaders who challenge the prevailing tide and inspire all of us to swim against the current. Let's jump in. Welcome back to another episode of Swimming Upstream. I'm Tom Luna, your host, and today we are at Excel in Ed. This is our second year of recording our podcast here, and it's a great opportunity to connect with education leaders from across the country. And right now we're going to visit with Steve Bowen. And Steve, thank you so much for being here. And our history goes back a long ways.
Yeah.
You were the state chief in Maine when I was the state superintendent in Idaho. Yeah. And we both worked on similar type projects when it came to technology in the classroom and stuff. But let's talk about your career. I guess before that you were a state legislator.
I was.
All right. And then you were, then you were the state chief.
Yeah, I had. So I was a middle and high school social studies teacher, and then kind of on a lark, I ran for the legislature. The story I told is that my wife got tired of me sort of complaining about how things are going. She said, "When are you going to go do something about it? Why don't you?" And so I knew some folks, and so I sort of ran and narrowly won my legislative seat, and took a leave from the classroom and went to do that. And then, so I served 2 terms in the legislature, and then I went to a state-based think tank that did education policy, a little tiny think tank, 5 or 6 people, and was kind of the education policy guy there and wrote a lot about education. And then when Paul LePage was elected, we sort of advised him and part of the transition team, and ended up being in his office as a member of his policy team. And then I did one of those things where you're supposed to go and find the new state chief. Oh. And I'm like, how I could do it, and so that's how it kind of ended up.
That Dick Cheney was responsible.
A little bit. It was a little bit of that. I told people that wasn't the intention from the beginning, but it sort of ended up that way. And in the time it was taking us, I knew people at the department from my time in the legislature, and so I was kind of going back and forth.
It's
and
a great
background. It worked.
It's a great background because I don't think enough people realize the relationship, the necessary relationship between a state chief and a legislature, because you rely on the legislature for appropriations and bills and policies, and you can't cast one vote, you can't sign one bill, right?
No,
so you have to work with them.
But they can create some work for you if they want to.
That's right. Yeah.
No, that was a key relationship. I had never been a building principal or superintendent, so that was the relationship I really needed to work on when I got to the department, because they didn't know me from a hole in the wall. I knew the legislature, and I could handle that, and we did move a lot of legislation, and I think got a lot of good stuff done. But I had to spend quite a bit of time with superintendents and a lot of time on the road visiting schools. The same kind of advice we give.
You had the privilege, like I did. You had a very supportive governor, right? And I don't care if you're an elected state superintendent or an appointed. If you and the governor aren't on the same page, the superintendent's not going to get much done, right?
That's true.
And so you had that fortune.
And I think you and I have both been at this a long time. In my years at CCSSO, going out and meeting with state chiefs that are sort of boxed out because they're elected, but they're elected in one party, everybody else is the other party. I mean, that's tough. Yeah. It's tough to navigate when you don't have any running room and you don't have anybody, in the governor's office who can support you. So I was lucky on that front.
Now you're with the Hoover Institute. The exact title then is executive director of
the Hoover Education Success Initiative.
And so talk a little bit about the Hoover Institution at the top, and then and then we'll talk a bit about their involvement in education and how long they've been doing that.
Yeah. So the Hoover Institution is a public policy think tank that's based at Stanford. It was founded by Herbert Hoover, who was in the first graduating class of Stanford and was a big supporter of Stanford. And when you go out to Stanford, the Hoover Tower is the dominant sort of building on the campus. And so he founded it it originally was founded and still serves as a library and archives. And so it's got a long history of collecting information, collecting data and things like that. And sort of over time transitioned into a public policy think tank, and is involved in lots of different areas. Education is a kind of a tiny slice, actually, of Hoover. It's a lot of national security, foreign policy, economists, political scientists. The director is Dr. Condoleezza Rice, is my boss, and so as you might imagine, we spend a lot of time on foreign policy and national security and areas of her expertise and the team there. So, but education is a small but mighty team, and for a long time have been doing research there. The senior fellows, write reports and do these kind of. I think Hoover has the advantage of time. It's very academically oriented, and that means it's not. We're not responding to the latest, greatest thing. We can take time to do these long studies. And so people like Rick Hanushek, who I work for, who's been doing this for years and years and years and years, one of the most renowned researchers in the country in education, has been doing, has been able to do this longitudinal study for a long time. And Mackie Raymond, who I also work for, just did the big charter school study that took decades to build. So I think the advantage that Hoover has is being able to have the time to go deep in some of these issues and generate really rigorous, academically supported research that will drive public policy. And that's why they brought me in. I'm not an academic. I want to go on the record and say that. They brought me in to connect to the policymaker community and get a sense of what are the issues that you're staying up at night that we could help do some research around. And then once, the Rick Hanusheks of the world write their papers, how do I then turn those papers around and help get those back into the hands of policymakers in formats that they'll read it. Like we all like the 50-page papers with the math equations and the rest of it, and we need those. But you and I know that state chiefs and policymakers, legislators are just not going to read those.
What's the executive
they don't have,
summary look like?
So we need to get it down to so my job is to go to these really super smart researchers and say, I love your 50-page paper. I need it like front and back of one page. Yeah. So that's kind of what I have a kind of a translating function there.
Fascinating.
Yeah, to turn that around.
The Hoover Institute's well respected.
Yes.
I mean, when they do publish, I think it's a pretty broad bipartisan, if you will,
I think so.
with and then the people that you mentioned from Condoleezza Rice on down are all known and respected
they're
individuals in their spaces.
Yeah, no, it's a great group, and they do some really important work. And I think the challenge is, if you're a state legislator and you're getting bombarded all day with stuff, and you have to make a vote on the tax policy, and then switch to healthcare, and then switch to agriculture, and then switch to education, like how can we get you something that's digestible? And the Hoover sort of communications team does a great job. If you go on the hoover.org website, which I recommend, you'll see lots of videos and lots of short things, and they do a lot to try and translate and get these big pieces of research into digestible chunks for people to use.
So what are some of the specific things you're hearing out there that are worthy of the Hoover Institute's research and kind of effort?
Yeah, I think the COVID recovery was a chunk of it, and so there was the team did a series of papers on that. I think at this point we this summer we commissioned a set of papers which we're going to be releasing over the winter, looking back on 40 years of reform since the nation at risk. So we have a whole slew of papers coming out. We asked a bunch of authors, like, all right, what have we been trying to do in these different areas, right? So there's going to be 12 papers. There's one on teacher effectiveness. There's one on pipeline. There's one on early childhood. There's one on funding models or governance models. And it's like we've been doing a lot of reform. It's been a lot for 40 years, like this churn. Yeah. And what came of any of it? And so we'll have these papers coming out this winter that will speak to kind of the impact. And as you might imagine, it's mixed, right? Sometimes these reforms worked, sometimes they didn't, sometimes they worked for a while and then fell apart, or they worked in some areas but not others. And so I think as we move forward, we're thinking about how do we change the discussion to systems change. Like this system, because of this churn of reform, has grown really good at holding off reform and resisting reform. And sometimes justifiably. Sometimes cockamamie ideas get put forward. And if you're a longtime teacher, you know that every fall you come in, it's something new. We're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then that gets dropped. So we're interested in sort of thinking through, should we structure education differently from a governance point of view? Like, how could we do this differently? And I think this came from actually when I first started at Hoover last fall, and had the first time I sat down with Director Rice, and she's a longtime proponent of education. It's really important to her. And she said, I feel like we're at the point where it's just like, what are we doing? What are we doing? Like, this is not working. We're burning out our teachers. Folks are leaving. Confidence in public education is declining. Like, we just can't keep doing this. So what can we do differently? So that's been kind of driving our work. And I think through the winter and into the spring, we'll have some interesting things coming out.
Do you think it'll end up in a similar document that came out 40 years ago?
It could be. I think I think one of the lessons learned from the original Nation at Risk is, it was a bold call to arms, And then it had this list of things to do, like go do this with teachers and do this with seating, with time and seat time, and do this with. And I think our sense is that over the years, there's been lots of lists. Every couple of years, every 5 years, somebody goes, oh, it's now the 25th anniversary of A Nation at Risk. And now let's do this with teachers and do like, and you get this kind of constant ongoing shuffle of reform. So I think we're disinclined to say, here's the new list 40 years on to do, instead of doing that, do this. I think it really is, can we think about this in an entirely different way? And that's a hard thing to do because it's so embedded in our culture, and how school is done is something that's
a lot of change.
It is, but I think the Hoover Institution is kind of uniquely positioned to be able to back up and think about that. And so we've got a couple of folks working on it, and we're thinking through like how can we facilitate a kind of community discussion, broader discussion about surely we can't do this for another 40 more years like this. Yeah. It's just not going to work.
Yeah.
And if we believe in public education, which we do, we've got to come up with some other way that we can have impact and turn around these schools that are really struggling. And so that's what we're working on.
I mean, we could talk a little bit more in detail. It's going to be a heavy lift because whatever the recommendations, there are so many different players and those who have a say in it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
One example I use is we were doing some work over in Dubai, education.
Yep.
And it struck me that they have a minister of education, and that one person, whatever that one person decides, that's what happens across the whole, Dubai, Emirate.
Yep.
But you think about the way we do education, and I'm not saying that system is better.
Right.
It isn't by far, because I'm a believer in local control. But if you're a believer in local control, then you have so many multiple layers of people that are involved that have decision making all the way down to school board members and then ultimately parents. Right. And how do you get all of those?
That's the challenge.
Lined up and going in the same direction. Yeah,
and I think we've talked about. So I work for Rick Hanushek. He's an economist, and so his thing is it's incentives. It's all about incentives.
Yeah.
So I think the question is, we have a system that serves a lot of adult needs. How do we build incentives? Can we restructure or reimagine the system so that the incentives are almost entirely, if not entirely, around student achievement and less about adult interests that sometimes drive these decisions? But you're right; it's a big lift. I think we're looking at systems overseas and other ways that this might be done. But I think you don't want to lose sight of the local control piece. You want to think about capacity to do these things. It's a lot of moving pieces, but I think it's a piece of work that's necessary, just because I think we all worry about the sustainability of this when we're driving teachers out of the classroom and administrators turn over, and it's a tough business.
And you have more and more kids leaving the public education system, right?
Yeah.
And then you have states considering, whether people's opinions on vouchers and stuff, whatever their opinion is, they're happening. Right.
Yes.
And that's another avenue of just more and more kids outside of public education. And so how do you right that ship?
Yeah, and you want to focus on that. And there's another sort of set of work that we're doing around citizenship, and how do we restore sort of the civic health of the nation. And this is a broader project, and there'll be more to come on that Hoover's doing more broadly. But there's a chunk of that, right? It's schools play a key role in the civic development of our young people. And if you do end up with this splintering, where these kids go to school here, and these kids are here, and these kids are here, like how do you maintain a kind of civic infrastructure that then gives these kids the skills they need to run the country? Because that's what we've got to have.
Yeah. When you look at the last 40 years, and you've seen, I mean, we both lived through part of it, at least in the last 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And you see different attempts. You mentioned incentives, right?
Yeah.
So we've seen that work. We've seen it not work. Right. Oftentimes it doesn't maintain because that requires funding, and if the funding goes away, regardless of if people like incentives or not, then those are gone.
Yeah.
So I think the question I always have in my mind is, what is the right balance, right? Because I don't think anybody is a real fan of the salary grid.
Yep.
I taught 8 years and have a master's degree.
Right.
I make the same amount as everybody else who's taught 8 years and has a master's degree. But how do you build either on top of that or outside of that, right? So that teachers who should be making more and deserve to make more are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has struck us as we looked at the data is, another set of this work is kind of looking at what we've been internally calling like this perfect storm of challenges that we had. So I was up in Marguerite Rosa's session earlier today. She's talking about the funding cliff that's coming up when the ESSER dollars run out. And we also know like there's enrollment problems, and there are places where student population is projected to decline, and so these school systems are going to lose kids over time, not just the kids that have stopped coming to school for whatever reason, but over time just the demographics are working against them. And you have teacher turnover. Like it's a combination, and the divisiveness that's driving people out. People don't want to be on school boards because they don't want to get screamed at by people at school board.
Yeah.
So you've just got this really tough challenge. But as we dug into the data on that, there's also local context, right? We talk about teacher shortages, and there are teacher shortages in some places, but other places there's not. And I think the challenge at a policymaker level is, how do you solve a problem that is hitting differently in different places? And I think, you and I both worked at the state level for a long time, and you do your best to target resources around the local challenges that districts may have, but that's hard to do.
Yeah.
And SEAs don't typically have the capacity, the state agency, to like, all right, I'm going to target this, target. It's much easier, as you say, to paint with a broad brush and say, this is our new funding model. It's going to apply equally to everybody. So I think part of what we want to explore is, can we build a system that is more responsive to student needs, but also takes into account that this school over here is different than that school over there.
Yeah.
And even if they have similar kids, they have different human beings in those buildings. And how do you build systems that respond to that? Yeah. So it's a challenge.
Well, and you mentioned funding formulas.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Even if everybody agrees on what this new model should look like, and building a funding formula that aligns with that. That's another whole lift, right?
Yeah. No, I still lay awake at night sometimes thinking about, if we tried to do funding changes when I was at the department, and, you walk over to the State House and legislators are walking around with printouts. And the question on the print, because they asked the department, all right, if we pass this funding model, what is that going to do for the schools in my district? Or are they going to get more funding or not?
Yeah, haves and
if it's
have-nots, right?
and if it's a fixed, if you're not adding new money, then
There's
money's
winners and
moving from,
losers.
so it becomes a spreadsheet battle. And I mean, I can remember walking around the State House and having legislators come up and, all right, walk me through this. Am I going to get? And that was really the question they wanted to know. Am I going to get more or not? And that's why how I'm going to vote. So it is hard to have those kind of higher level discussions about, all right, how is this money even being used? When are we going to have that discussion? It becomes. It oftentimes is less about like how much money is going out versus how is it actually being deployed in schools, and is it being used in the right way? And again, Marguerite and others who've done a lot of work, and Rick Hanushek and the folks at Hoover done a lot of work around how those dollars can get used more effectively. But that means building some capacity either at the state or the district level to think differently about how to use money, and that's not a capacity that a lot of them have.
Yeah. Let me ask you about another thing that's near and dear to me. You're from Maine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from Idaho. We have a lot of rural parts in our state. It's primarily is rural. I think every community in Idaho fits some definition of rural under a federal definition, right? I'm sure Maine is in the same category. No Child Left Behind, I think it's kind of like the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? There's a little bit of all of that.
Yeah.
But I do believe that one thing that was good was that it really did start focusing more on students and all students, not just some.
Yes.
The challenge was the perception of the reality. It would work. If it was going to work, it was going to work in an urban area, maybe suburban, but not so much rural. Yeah. And so when you look at the kinds of changes that we're obviously going to make, what are your thoughts on rural education? In many ways, they have a lot of the same issues that inner cities do, but it's just doesn't get as much attention. But
it's a real challenge. I know, when I was at the department trying to think about how do you build capacity in these districts, especially, there's a lot of good work going on around, competency-based learning and next generation assessments and a lot of these and implementation of technology that requires some district level capacity to execute all of that. Yeah. And, I'm sure it's the same. I mean, we've got school districts in Maine with, 50 kids in them, right? So, we spent a lot of time when I was at the department, like, can we do things regionally? And again, I think it goes to how do you align the incentives the right way so that districts feel like they can partner and work together to build some of that infrastructure. Maine is one of the states that doesn't have like a regional level of BOCES or one of those kind of regional models. So is that something you could build that would build some, but if we're going to do this, you're going to have to build capacity somewhere to do some of these things. And And my experience with the legislature, when I would go as the chief and say we need more dollars at the department to build that capacity, that was a tough sell. And the unions and everybody would come in. Well, that's less dollars going out to the field. This is dollars that's just going to disappear here in the state capitol.
In Idaho,
you couldn't get any capacity built at the state agency to do this stuff. And it was like, well,
the simple math is if it was $100,000,
yes,
then that's 2 teachers.
Yes,
that's,
right.
And you had
that's
to
how
defend,
you did it.
you had to defend that, right?
Yeah.
Which is very hard,
right.
To message against. Let's wrap up, but take a few minutes.
Sure.
How can people become more aware and kind of follow the work of the Hoover Institute going forward? You have these papers that are going to be released.
We do,
talk about that.
You could go to the hoover.org website and you can see all of our stuff on there. We do have ways that you can sign up for newsletters and things like that, and we have a monthly education newsletter. We're revamping the website a little bit, so we're going to update that as these papers come out. We're going to kind of do a refresh. But again, the Hoover team is very good at taking these kind of complex pieces of research and turning them into really concise little 3-minute videos and 4-minute videos and things with animations, and they're really good at that. So I think people will be able to see how we're taking this really, really robust academic kind of muscular research and turn it into something digestible. But folks can sign up and we'll send you all our stuff.
Great. 40 years ago, Nation at Risk. Wow.
Yeah, hard to believe. It's worth reading. We read it again, and it's an interesting document. I think one of the other things that we've talked about is what's the new call to arms.
Yeah.
The Nation at Risk launched the modern school reform era, and I think part of the discussion we're having is what's going to be the next Sputnik, the next Nation at Risk that's going to, I think a lot of us thought that COVID was going to be it, right? That this is a crisis that we have to respond to. And the system you don't seem to see that. So I think that's part of the question going forward is how do we get people thinking again and prioritizing education? We're in election year. You're not hearing much about education. So there's something there about how do we elevate this issue that
this is probably the second or third election. Every 4 years where education has not been.
It's not.
It has not been, a part of the conversation. It gets lip service, right? And sometimes it just gets lip service. We'll leave it at that, right? But
and we have to find out other ways to do it. We had a little conference out at Hoover just a couple of weeks ago, and we got talking about Emily Hanford's podcast, Sold a Story, and how that has launched a substantial amount of state legislation, probably as much as like Race to the Top or some of these other initiatives. That little podcast led to a lot of action at the state level. So what's the next iteration of that? How do we elevate this issue? I think that's something we've got to work on.
I look at it through this lens when I talk to people about where we're at in education and where we need to be is I've got a new grandchild, right? And when she graduates from high school, it will be basically the year 2040, 2041, right?
Yeah.
What's the world going to look like? Geopolitical, economic, right? The advancements in medicine and technology. None of us can even predict what it's going to look like. And what is a child that graduates from high school in 2040 going to need to know and be able to do?
Right.
We don't know. But now ask yourselves, do we have an education system that is nimble enough and flexible enough to adapt quick enough so that those children are going to graduate? We all know the answer. The answer is no. So what do we do, right? And, and how do we get people to focus? You said that earlier, focus on student achievement.
Yep.
And when you focus on that, then you're willing to make whatever changes are necessary.
And lifelong learning. I mean, my girls are, this pains me to say this, but they're 21 and 24, and they're sort of starting in their careers.
Wow.
But, I've tried to reinforce with them, you're going to have a number of jobs.
Yes.
I used to say when I was teaching to my students, look, Bill Gates became the richest man in the world in an industry that didn't exist when he was your age. So you have to think about how you can continue to grow and learn, because some kind of new technology is going to come along that none of us can foresee. And you're going to have to figure out a way to make a future out of that. And that means you've got to not only build basic skills, but also have a mindset that is a continuous learning mindset. And that's what we try to reinforce. But it's barreling down a hill on us, so we need to be ready.
Yeah. Well, Steve, thanks for joining us
Sure,
here.
you bet.
And congratulations. I knew you've been there a little over a year, but congratulations on your
bet, I
position there at
appreciate
the Hoover Institute. And we always end our podcast with a question. You're from Maine.
Yes, I am.
Right? And you're still living there, but share with us
born and raised.
share with us one piece of trivia or one piece of information about Maine that most people don't know and they would find it interesting.
Well, I don't know about the interesting part. I mean, the thing we usually use is Maine is the only state that borders only one other state.
Oh.
So we really are in a corner up there. We've got New Hampshire, and then we're surrounded by Canadians on the other sides, and then we've got the ocean on the last side. So we're kind of up there in a corner, and it's meant that we've had to adapt and kind of find our own way, and because nobody's coming.
Kind of lonely.
Well, a little bit. I don't want to offend our friends in Maritime Canada, but people don't come through Maine to head someplace else. It's a little bit at the end of the line, but we've been able to make it work. But yeah, it's a lovely country, and we'd love everybody to come up and see us and have some
Well,
lunch.
I've been there. It is beautiful, and it reminds me of Northern Idaho.
It does. It's
right?
very much like Northern Idaho.
But I will tell you that's interesting because Idaho is the state that is surrounded by the most states.
It's
right?
really,
So
right.
We have 6 states, and then the top of the state is Canada.
That's
so we're
right.
surrounded by 6 states in one country.
Yeah,
so
we got the Canadians too. Yeah.
there's one that's interesting. But hey, thanks for being on
You
the
bet,
podcast.
Tom. Anytime. It's great to see you.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for listening. And remember, our children may only be 22% of our population, but they represent 100% of our future. If you found this conversation valuable, subscribe to our YouTube channel and find us on your favorite podcast platform. Swimming Upstream is part of the Strategos Podcast Network. To view the entire lineup of our shows, visit our website, strategosgroup.com.